Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Middle school was supposed to be about awkward crushes and terrible cafeteria food, not about learning that people you trust can completely betray you. I was 13 when it happened, living in a quiet suburb outside Denver where everyone knew everyone and kids still rode bikes until the streetlights came on. My parents both worked long hours at the hospital, dad as a radiologist, mom as a nurse, which meant our house became the default hangout spot after school. That Friday in October felt like any other weekend was starting, except I'd finally convinced my parents to let me have Blake stay over for the entire weekend. Blake and I had been tight since 4th grade when he'd moved here from somewhere in Ohio, and he practically lived at my house anyway, always showing up with that worn-out skateboard under his arm and a Monster Energy drink in his hand. The thing about Blake was that he had this way of making everything seem like an adventure, even just walking to the gas station for snacks. He'd been different lately though, quieter, showing up to school with expensive new shoes one week, a brand new phone the next, always saying his uncle had gotten him stuff. His family lived in one of those apartment complexes near the highway, the kind with peeling paint and broken playground equipment, and I remember feeling bad that he never wanted anyone coming over to his place. That Friday afternoon, we'd spent hours playing video games in the basement, eating way too much pizza and watching horror movies that we definitely weren't supposed to be watching. Around midnight, my parents went to bed, reminding us not to stay up too late, and Blake suggested we sneak outside to skateboard in the empty church parking lot down the street. We ended up chickening out because it was freezing cold, and instead crashed in the living room with more junk food and another movie. I must have passed out around 2 in the morning, sprawled on the couch with Doritos crumbs all over my shirt. What woke me up wasn't a sound exactly, but more like the absence of sound. You know how sometimes your brain just knows something's different? The TV was still on, casting this blue glow across the room, but Blake wasn't on the floor where he'd set up his sleeping bag. I figured he'd gone to the bathroom, so I just lay there half asleep, waiting to hear the toilet flush or his footsteps coming back down the stairs. 5 minutes passed, then 10, and this weird uneasiness started creeping through my chest, the kind you get when you're home alone and hear a door creak. I got up slowly, trying not to make the floorboards squeak, and that's when I noticed Blake's sleeping bag was still perfectly arranged, like he'd never even gotten in it. The bathroom door upstairs was open with the light off, and I could see from where I stood that nobody was in there. Then I heard it, a soft sliding sound like a drawer being pulled open very, very carefully. It was coming from down the hall, from the direction of my parents' bedroom. My first thought was maybe Dad had gotten up for something, but then I remembered seeing both my parents' cars in the driveway when we'd thought about going skateboarding. The sliding sound happened again, followed by the quiet clink of metal against metal, and my whole body went rigid because I knew that sound. It was Mom's jewelry box, the wooden one she kept on her dresser with the little brass latch that always made that exact noise. I crept toward the hallway, keeping close to the wall where I knew the floor was less likely to creak, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The door to my parents' room was open just enough for me to see inside, and there was Blake, illuminated by the small flashlight on his phone, going through my mom's dresser drawers like he was shopping at Target. He had his backpack open on the bed, the same black JanSport he brought to school every day, and I could see him dropping things into it. Mom's pearl necklace that had been her grandmother's, the envelope of cash my parents kept in the top drawer for emergencies, Dad's vintage watch collection from the small wooden box he treasured. Blake was moving with this practiced efficiency that made my chest feel hollow, like he'd done this before, like he'd been planning it, maybe even from the moment I'd invited him over. I must have made some sound, maybe just a sharp intake of breath, because Blake's head snapped up and our eyes met across the dark room. For a second, neither of us moved, and his face went through this bizarre series of expressions: surprise, then guilt, then something harder that I'd never seen on him before, like a mask had fallen off and I was seeing who he really was for the first time. "Oh," he said, super casual, like I'd just caught him grabbing a snack from the kitchen. "Hey man, your mom asked me to get something for her." It was such an obviously stupid lie that I almost laughed, except nothing about this was funny. My mom was asleep 3 feet away from where he was standing, and we both knew it. Blake zipped up his backpack in one quick motion and stood up, and I noticed he was fully dressed. Jeans, hoodie, even his shoes, while I was still in my pajama pants and an old band t-shirt. "Put it back," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady even though I felt like I might throw up. "Blake, what the hell are you doing? Put everything back right now." He took a step toward me, and for a terrifying moment I thought he might try to fight me or push past me, but instead he just stood there holding that backpack like it was glued to his hand. "You don't understand," he said, and his voice had this weird, desperate edge to it. "I need this. My mom. We're getting evicted next week. I wasn't going to take that much, just enough to help out." But even as he said it, I could see the calculation in his eyes, trying to figure out if he could get past me, if he could still somehow get away with this. Behind him, my dad shifted in bed, letting out one of those loud sleep sighs, and we both went completely still until he settled again. The silence stretched between us like a rubber band about to snap, and then Blake did something I'll never forget. He smiled at me, this sad, broken smile that somehow made everything worse. "Come on, man," he said quietly. "Your parents have insurance, they're doctors, they won't even miss this stuff. You know my situation. You've seen where I live." And the horrible thing was, part of me wanted to let him go, wanted to pretend I hadn't seen anything, because this was Blake, the kid who'd taught me to skateboard, who'd been there when my dog died, who knew all my secrets. But then I thought about my mom waking up to find her grandmother's necklace gone, my dad realizing his watches were missing, and how they'd look at me when they found out I'd invited the thief into our home. "If you walk out with that bag," I heard myself say, "I'm waking up my parents right now." Blake's expression changed again, hardening into something cold and unfamiliar, and he pushed past me, bumping my shoulder hard enough to knock me into the doorframe. I grabbed for his backpack but missed, and he was already heading down the stairs, taking them 2 at a time. I ran after him, my bare feet slapping against the hardwood, but by the time I reached the front door, he was already outside, sprinting down the dark street with that backpack bouncing on his shoulders. I stood there in the doorway, October air cutting right through my thin shirt, watching my best friend disappear into the darkness with my family's belongings. The smart thing would have been to wake my parents immediately, but I just stood there like an idiot, some part of me still hoping he'd turn around, come back, say it was all some stupid prank or misunderstanding. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat in the living room, staring at Blake's abandoned sleeping bag, at his phone charger still plugged into the wall, at the half-eaten bag of chips we'd been sharing just hours earlier. When my parents woke up around 7, I told them everything, watching my mom's face go from confusion to shock to this deep, horrible disappointment that seemed directed more at herself than at Blake. The police came around 9, took my statement, photographed the room, dusted for fingerprints even though we all knew exactly who'd done it. Blake's mom didn't answer her phone, and when the officers went to their apartment, the landlord said they'd cleared out in the middle of the night, not evicted, just gone, leaving behind damaged walls and 3 months of unpaid rent. My mom's necklace, my dad's watches, the emergency cash, none of it was ever recovered. About 3 weeks later, I was eating lunch alone in the cafeteria when Casey Hoffman sat down across from me, looking pale and exhausted. "Did you hear about Blake?" she asked, and before I could respond, she told me how he'd stayed at her house 2 weeks before mine, how her sister's iPad and their dad's golf clubs had gone missing the next day. Then Jordan Martinez overheard us and came over. Same story, different weekend. His mom's laptop and a jar of quarters his family had been saving for vacation. By the end of lunch, we'd identified 6 different kids Blake had stayed with over the past 2 months, always picking houses where he knew the layout, where the parents trusted him, where nobody would suspect the kid who'd been coming over for years. The detective called it a systematic pattern of exploitation, but to us it was simpler than that. Blake had used our friendship like a weapon, turned our trust into his personal ATM. The last time I saw anything about Blake was a year later, when my mom showed me a newspaper article she'd found online. He'd been arrested 2 states over, caught breaking into a house during what was supposed to be another sleepover with a new friend. 16 years old and already facing multiple charges across 3 states. I stared at his mugshot for a long time. He looked older, thinner, with dark circles under his eyes, and this hollow expression like he'd already given up on everything. Sometimes I still wonder if there were signs I missed, if I could have helped him before he became whatever he became. But mostly I just remember that night, standing in my parents' doorway, watching him vanish into the darkness with a backpack full of stolen memories, learning the hard way that sometimes the monsters aren't strangers lurking in the shadows. Sometimes they're the people you trust most, sitting right across from you, sharing your chips and laughing at your jokes, waiting for the perfect moment to show you who they really are. The 3 of us had been planning that weekend at Nathan's place for months. It was late November 2022, right after Thanksgiving break, and Nathan's parents had gone to visit his grandmother in California, leaving him alone at their farmhouse about 40 minutes outside of Eugene. I was 21 then, working nights at a warehouse while trying to figure out what to do with my life. Nathan and I had been friends since middle school, and we'd met Garrett through a mutual friend at a concert earlier that year. The house sat on 12 acres of mostly wooded land, with the nearest neighbor being a half-mile down the gravel road. Perfect for 3 guys who wanted to drink beer, play video games too loud, and just hang out without anyone bothering us. Nathan's place had always been our go-to spot because of how isolated it was. You could barely get cell service unless you stood in specific spots near the kitchen window. We'd arrived around 6 that Friday evening, arms full of beer, frozen pizzas, and enough energy drinks to keep us wired through whatever gaming marathon we had planned. The house itself was nothing special, a 2-story colonial that Nathan's dad had been slowly renovating for the past decade. The living room had this massive stone fireplace that we got going right away, and we set up our gaming station on the coffee table, controllers and cables everywhere. Garrett seemed a bit quieter than usual that night, kept checking his phone even though he barely had signal. Mentioned something about his ex-girlfriend texting him earlier. Nathan and I didn't push it. We figured he'd talk if he wanted to. By midnight, we were all pretty buzzed, yelling at the TV during some intense matches, empty beer cans starting to pile up on every available surface. The wind had picked up outside, making the old windows rattle in their frames, but inside we were warm and loud and having the exact kind of night we'd planned. Around 2 in the morning, we decided to take a break from gaming. Nathan went to the kitchen to heat up another pizza, and I was sprawled on the couch scrolling through my phone in that one spot where I could get a bar of signal. Garrett had been getting progressively more antsy as the night went on, bouncing his leg constantly, cracking his knuckles every few minutes. He stood up suddenly and mumbled something about needing some air. I barely looked up from my phone, just gave him a thumbs up. Nathan was singing some stupid song in the kitchen, banging pots around looking for a clean plate. The front door opened and closed with a soft click. Nothing unusual about someone stepping out for a minute. We had no idea that would be the last normal moment of the night. Garrett's controller sat abandoned on the armrest, his half-finished beer still cold on the side table, and that Metallica hoodie he always wore was still draped over the back of his chair. Must have dozed off on that couch because the next thing I knew, Nathan was shaking my shoulder. The room was darker now, just the TV casting blue shadows on the walls, and the fire had died down to glowing embers. My phone showed 4:47 a.m. Nathan's face looked confused more than worried at that point, asking if Garrett had come back inside. I sat up trying to clear the fog from my brain and noticed Garrett's stuff exactly where he'd left it hours ago. We both figured he'd crashed in one of the upstairs bedrooms. Wouldn't be the first time one of us had wandered off to pass out during a late night. Nathan went upstairs to check the guest rooms, while I looked in the downstairs bathroom and even the basement, calling Garrett's name with increasing volume. Every room came up empty. His truck was still parked outside next to Nathan's Jeep and my old Ford, keys visible on the kitchen counter where he'd tossed them when we arrived. That's when that first real wave of uneasiness hit me, this heavy feeling settling in my chest. Nathan grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, one of those heavy mag lights his dad kept for emergencies, and we headed outside. The temperature had dropped significantly, probably mid-30s, and our breath came out in white puffs. We started calling Garrett's name, our voices echoing off the trees. The property was huge, and in the darkness, with just that single flashlight beam cutting through the black, everything looked different and hostile. We checked around the house first, the old barn that stored lawn equipment, even looked inside the chicken coop that had been empty for years. Nothing. About 50 yards from the house, where the maintained yard met the wild grass and eventually the tree line, Nathan's flashlight caught something pale against the dark ground. Garrett's jacket, this distinctive gray and blue North Face he'd saved up for months to buy, was lying in the wet grass like someone had just dropped it. My mouth went completely dry seeing it there, and Nathan's face had gone white even in the dim light. His phone was about 10 feet away from the jacket, face down in the dirt, screen cracked but still functional when I picked it up. 17 missed calls from someone named Ashley, probably the ex he'd mentioned. The last app he'd used was Instagram, timestamp showing 2:13 a.m., just minutes after he'd stepped outside. We kept searching the tree line with growing desperation, Nathan sweeping the flashlight in wide arcs while I used my phone's light, both of us shouting until our throats were raw. The woods seemed to swallow our voices, and every shadow looked like it could be a person lying on the ground. We found what looked like drag marks in the muddy area near where the jacket was, these deep grooves in the earth leading toward the trees before disappearing in the undergrowth. Nathan wanted to follow them into the woods, but I grabbed his arm. We needed more help, more lights, and honestly, I was scared of what we might find in those dark trees. The sun wouldn't be up for another 2 hours, and standing there in that field, I felt more helpless than I'd ever felt in my life. We ran back to the house and Nathan called 911 while I tried Garrett's phone. Maybe someone had called or texted something that would explain this. The dispatcher kept asking if Garrett had been drinking, if he'd taken any drugs, if there'd been an argument. Nathan kept saying no, 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 but I could hear his voice cracking. They said they'd send a unit out, but warned it might take 30 to 40 minutes given our location. While we waited, we went back outside with every flashlight Nathan could find, plus some old camping lanterns from the garage. This time we went deeper into the woods, following those drag marks until they disappeared into a thick patch of blackberry bushes. My jeans got torn up from the thorns, and Nathan's hands were bleeding from pushing branches aside, but we kept going. About a quarter mile in, we found a cigarette butt. Garrett smoked Marlboro Reds, and this was the right brand. But that didn't make sense because the jacket and phone were back near the yard, and why would he walk this far into the woods just to smoke? The police arrived just as the sky was starting to lighten to a dark gray. 2 officers, both looking tired and skeptical, until we showed them the jacket, the phone, and those drag marks. One of them radioed for additional units and mentioned something about calling in search and rescue. They asked us the same questions the dispatcher had, plus more. Had Garrett been having problems with anyone? Did he owe money? Was he involved in anything illegal? We kept explaining he was just a regular guy, worked at a sporting goods store, lived with his mom, played guitar in a crappy band on weekends. More cops showed up, then paramedics on standby, then volunteers with dogs. The dogs picked up a scent immediately, following a path that curved through the woods, crossed a creek, and headed toward the old logging road that ran along the back of Nathan's property. One of the officers mentioned that the logging road connected to the main highway about 3 miles north. The way he said it, the careful tone in his voice, made my chest tighten all over again. By noon, there were probably 30 people involved in the search. Nathan's parents were driving back from California, and someone had contacted Garrett's mom, who showed up looking absolutely destroyed, clutching a recent photo of him to show the volunteers. We weren't allowed to join the official search anymore. Liability issues, they said. So Nathan and I sat on his front porch watching teams disappear into the woods and emerge empty-handed. I kept replaying the night in my head, trying to remember if Garrett had said anything specific when he went outside, if there'd been any noise we didn't register at the time. Around 2 in the afternoon, Nathan's phone rang. It was his dad, who'd been listening to a police scanner app while driving. They'd found someone matching Garrett's description at a hospital in Springfield, about 25 miles away. The person had been brought in by a passing motorist who'd found him stumbling along Highway 126, covered in mud and blood, barely conscious. Nathan and I drove there going 90 the whole way, not caring about speed limits, just needing to know if it was really him. It was Garrett, but seeing him in that hospital bed made me wish it wasn't. His face was swollen beyond recognition, purple and yellow bruises covering every visible inch of skin. His left eye was completely shut, his lips split in multiple places. Dried blood still caked in his hair despite the nurse's attempts to clean him up. 3 broken ribs, a dislocated shoulder, defensive wounds on his hands and arms. The doctor said he'd been found in a drainage ditch beside the highway around 9 that morning, hypothermic and in shock. When he finally woke up and saw us there, he started crying. Not normal crying, but these horrible body-shaking sobs that made the heart monitor start beeping faster. The nurse had to give him something to calm down before he could even try to speak. His voice came out as barely a whisper, and we had to lean in close to hear him. He said he'd gone out for a cigarette, walked toward the trees to get out of the wind. Someone had grabbed him from behind, pressed something over his mouth that smelled like chemicals. The next thing he remembered was being in the back of a vehicle, bouncing around, unable to move his arms or see anything because of some kind of hood or bag over his head. He said there were 2 of them, maybe 3. He couldn't be sure because they barely spoke, and when they did, it was in whispers. The ride felt like it lasted forever, lots of turns, the sound of gravel, then pavement, then gravel again. At some point they stopped and dragged him out, started asking him questions that made no sense. Where was the money? Who else knew about the shipment? Why was he at Nathan's house? He kept trying to tell them they had the wrong person, that he didn't know what they were talking about, but every denial just made them angrier. They beat him methodically, taking breaks to ask the same questions over and over. Garrett remembered the smell of cigarettes and cheap cologne. One of them had a wheeze when he breathed heavy, like asthma or something. Hours passed like this. Questions, violence, accusations about someone named Eddie who was supposedly Garrett's cousin or brother. Finally, one of them got a phone call, stepped away to take it. Garrett heard him say something like "wrong kid" and clean it up. They argued briefly. Then everything went quiet. The next thing Garrett knew, he was being dumped on wet ground, heard vehicle doors slam and tires spinning on gravel as they drove away. He'd managed to crawl out of the ditch despite his injuries, made it to the road where that motorist found him. The police took his statement, but Garrett could tell they were skeptical about some parts. The randomness of it, the lack of clear motive, no vehicle description beyond maybe a truck or van. They investigated for weeks, came back to Nathan's property multiple times, interviewed everyone at the party, checked security cameras from gas stations along possible routes. Nothing. No matching tire tracks, no DNA evidence that led anywhere, no reports of similar incidents. The detective assigned to the case told Garrett's mom they believed something traumatic had happened, given his injuries, but without more evidence or witnesses. The trail was cold. Garrett never came back to Nathan's house after that, actually moved to Portland a few months later to live with his aunt. Last I heard, he was doing better, seeing a therapist, working at a bookstore. But Nathan and I never had another weekend at that house. Nathan's parents ended up selling the property the following year. Sometimes I drive past that area on my way to other places, and I always wonder if those men, whoever they were, ever realized they destroyed an innocent kid's life because they grabbed the wrong person that night. That night at Megan's house in the summer of 2017 started like any other sleepover we'd had since middle school. We were 16, thought we were invincible, and her parents had gone to bed around 10:30 after checking on us twice to make sure we weren't doing anything stupid. Megan lived in this quiet subdivision in Michigan, where all the houses looked basically the same, two-story colonials with attached garages and those decorative shutters that don't actually shut. Her room was at the back of the house, facing the woods that separated their neighborhood from the main road about half a mile away. We'd been watching horror movies all night, eating way too much popcorn, and talking about this guy from our chemistry class, who Megan had been texting for weeks. Around 2 in the morning, she got this wild idea that we should sneak out and walk around the block, just to prove we could do it without her parents noticing. The air outside felt thick and humid, the kind that makes your clothes stick to your skin the second you step out. All the streetlights in her neighborhood had this orange glow that made everything look weird and dreamlike, and the only sounds were crickets and the distant hum of the highway beyond the trees. We were barefoot because shoes would have made too much noise on the stairs, and I remember the sidewalk still felt warm from the day's heat. Megan was wearing these ridiculous pink pajama shorts with unicorns on them, and I had on an old volleyball camp t-shirt that came down to my knees. We were trying so hard not to laugh at how ridiculous we looked, speed walking down the street like we were on some secret mission. About 3 houses down, we passed the Andersons' place where their ancient golden retriever usually barked at everything. But thankfully, he must have been inside because their yard stayed quiet. The whole street stretched out empty in both directions. Not a single car or person in sight, just rows of dark houses with their porch lights on. We'd made it about halfway around the block when I first noticed the car. It was this dark sedan, maybe a Toyota or something similar, parked at the corner where Megan's Street met Willow Drive. What caught my attention wasn't just that it was there, people park on the street all the time, but that someone was sitting inside it in complete darkness. No dome light, no phone screen glow, nothing. Just the faint outline of a person in the driver's seat, perfectly still. Megan was going on about how her older sister had snuck out all the time in high school and never got caught, but I grabbed her wrist and whispered for her to shut up for a second. When we both turned to look, the car's engine started. Not loud or aggressive, just this low purr like when someone's trying to start their car quietly in the morning. But the headlights stayed off, and it began rolling forward, creeping along at maybe 5 miles per hour, the same speed we were walking. My whole body went rigid, like every muscle tensed up at once, and Megan must have felt it too because she stopped mid-sentence about her sister. The car kept pace with us, staying about 30 feet back, moving when we moved, stopping when we stopped to test if we were being paranoid. We weren't. I could barely make out the windshield in the darkness, but there was definitely someone behind the wheel, just this shapeless shadow that seemed to be watching us. Megan tried to play it cool, said maybe they were just lost or looking for an address, but her voice had this high-pitched quality that told me she didn't believe that any more than I did. We started walking faster, not quite running yet, but definitely speed walking, and the car matched our pace exactly. The sound of its tires rolling slowly over the asphalt seemed impossibly loud in the quiet night, this steady crushing sound like someone grinding pills with a mortar and pestle. Neither of us said it out loud, but we both knew we needed to get back to her house immediately. The moment we turned the corner onto Megan's Street, we broke into a full sprint. Our bare feet slapped against the concrete, and I could hear Megan's breathing getting ragged beside me. Behind us, the car's engine revved. Not aggressively, but just enough to keep up, still with those headlights off like some predator that doesn't need light to hunt. Every house we passed felt like a milestone. The Johnsons with their stupid lawn gnomes, the Washingtons with their boat parked in the driveway, then finally Megan's house coming into view. The car suddenly accelerated, pulling up alongside us, and that's when I saw the driver's window was down. There was a man inside, maybe 40 or 50, wearing what looked like a baseball cap pulled low. He wasn't looking at the road at all. His head was turned completely toward us, tracking our movement. Megan screamed, this raw, terrified sound I'd never heard from her before, and we practically flew up her driveway, fumbling with the spare key hidden under the fake rock by the garden. Once we got inside and locked the door, we stood there in the dark foyer, panting and dripping sweat, trying to process what just happened. Through the narrow window beside the door, we could see the car had stopped right in front of Megan's house, engine still running, still no lights. It just sat there, idling. We crept into the living room and peeked through the blinds, and the car began moving again, crawling past the house so slowly it took almost a full minute to clear the property. Then it reached the end of the street, turned around in the cul-de-sac, and came back. This went on for hours. The car would drive to one end of the street, turn around, come back, sometimes stopping for 10 or 15 minutes right in front of the house, sometimes parking across the street. We thought about waking up Megan's parents, but we were terrified they'd think we were making it up to avoid getting in trouble for sneaking out. So we sat there on the living room floor, backs against the couch, watching through a crack in the blinds as this car circled like a shark that had found prey, but couldn't quite reach it. Around 4:30 in the morning, something changed. The car pulled up directly in front of the house, and this time the driver got out. He was wearing regular clothes, jeans and a dark t-shirt, nothing that stood out except for how normal he looked, which somehow made it worse. He walked up to the edge of the lawn, maybe 10 feet from the front door, and just stood there staring at the house. Megan grabbed my arm so hard her nails dug into my skin, and we both held our breath like he might hear us breathing from inside. He pulled out what looked like a small notebook and wrote something down, then walked along the front of the house, examining the windows. When he got to the living room window where we were hiding, we dropped to the floor completely, pressing ourselves flat against the carpet. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, this thunderous rhythm that seemed impossibly loud. After what felt like forever but was probably only 30 seconds, we heard his footsteps moving away, back toward the car. The engine started again, and he resumed his slow patrol of the street. The sky started getting lighter around 5:45, that pale gray color before the sun actually comes up, and we thought maybe he'd leave once daylight hit. But he didn't. The car kept making its rounds, sometimes stopping to idle for 20 minutes at a time, always in view of Megan's house. We'd moved to her bedroom by then, sitting on her bed and taking turns watching out her window. That's when we noticed something that made everything even worse. There were scratches on the car's passenger door, long and deep, like someone had tried to claw their way out. Megan's neighbor, Mr. Brennan, came out around 6:15 to get his newspaper, and the car immediately drove away, normal speed this time, headlights on like any other morning commuter. We thought it was over finally, but 15 minutes later, after Mr. Brennan had gone back inside, the car returned, resuming its slow crawl. The driver was smart. Every time someone came outside to walk their dog or get the paper, he'd leave, only to come back once the street was empty again. By 7 o'clock, we couldn't take it anymore. Megan finally woke up her parents, and her dad went from angry about us sneaking out to concerned to absolutely furious when he saw the car still circling outside. He called 911 immediately while her mom kept us in the kitchen, making us drink water and asking us over and over if we were okay, if the man had said anything to us, if we'd seen his license plate. We hadn't. The plates were covered with something dark, maybe mud or tape, we couldn't tell. Her dad stood at the front window with his phone describing the car to the dispatcher, and that must have spooked the driver because suddenly the car sped off, tires actually squealing this time. But here's the thing that still messes with me. As it drove away, I saw there was someone else in the back seat. Just a shadow of a person, slumped against the window, not moving at all. The police arrived about 10 minutes later. 2 officers who took our statements while Megan's parents hovered nearby, her mom crying quietly into her dad's shoulder. The officers told us they'd increase patrols in the area, but they also said something that turned my blood to ice water. There had been 3 attempted abductions in the past month, all involving young women between 15 and 20, all occurring within a 5-mile radius of Megan's neighborhood. The suspect vehicle in each case was described as a dark sedan with obscured plates. and in one attempt, the girl had managed to escape, but not before noticing scratch marks on the inside of the passenger door. The officer showing us photos on his tablet zoomed in on one picture from a security camera 2 weeks earlier. The car was identical, down to the damaged passenger door and the baseball cap the driver wore. They said we were lucky, that most of the time these situations escalate quickly. But the presence of houses and potential witnesses probably kept him from trying anything more aggressive. What really got me was when the younger officer mentioned, almost offhandedly, that they'd found DNA evidence in one attempted grab that matched an unsolved case from 2015 where a girl went missing from a neighboring county and was found dead 3 days later. The police stayed for another hour, taking photos of the street, interviewing neighbors who hadn't seen anything unusual until that morning, and setting up a detective appointment for the next day. Megan and I gave them every detail we could remember: the man's height, build, the way he'd tilted his head when watching us, how he'd held that notebook, the exact pattern of his circling. The detective who came the next day, a woman named Detective Lawson, had us work with a sketch artist, and when the drawing was done, Megan and I just stared at it in silence. Seeing that face on paper, those deep-set eyes and thin mouth, made everything real in a way that felt like a punch to the gut. Detective Lawson said they'd distribute the sketch to all patrol units and neighboring jurisdictions, and she gave us her direct number, telling us to call immediately if we saw the car or the man again. For weeks after that, I couldn't sleep properly, kept imagining that car creeping down my own street, that man standing on my lawn taking notes. Megan's parents installed security cameras and motion sensor lights, and her dad started working from home more often. We never snuck out again, obviously, and even now, years later, I still check for cars driving without headlights whenever I'm out at night. They caught him 3 months later, 2 states over. His name was Gregory Vance, and when they arrested him, they found zip ties, duct tape, and a hunting knife in his car, along with a notebook full of addresses, physical descriptions, and daily routines of dozens of young women. Megan's address was in there, along with notes about her bedroom window facing the woods and the fact that her parents were heavy sleepers. But what haunts me most is that he'd written our descriptions from that night. 2 girls, 1 blonde, 1 brunette, barefoot, minimal clothing, no phones visible, vulnerable. The person in his back seat that morning turned out to be a mannequin he used to make his car look less suspicious, like he was just driving with a sleeping passenger. He pled guilty to 8 counts of attempted kidnapping and 1 count of murder, getting life without parole. The prosecutor said we were incredibly lucky, that based on his pattern and the evidence found, he'd been minutes away from getting out of his car and trying to force his way into Megan's house when her dad called the police. Sometimes I think about how different everything could have been if we'd stayed inside that night, if we'd never seen him, if he'd had the chance to come back when he was more prepared. But mostly, I try not to think about it at all. It was the spring of 2016, and I was 15, just a sophomore trying to survive high school in a small town outside of Seattle. My social circle was pretty limited back then. I was the kid who spent lunch breaks reading comics in the library, avoiding the cafeteria chaos. That's why when Brian Fitzgerald invited me to his house for a sleepover that Friday, I jumped at the chance. Brian had transferred to our school 3 months earlier, and he seemed cool enough, always cracking jokes in chemistry class and sharing his chips during breaks. His family had moved into this old Victorian house about 20 minutes from downtown, one of those places with peeling paint and a wraparound porch that looked like it had stories to tell. I remember my mom dropping me off around 7 that evening, commenting on how the house needed some work, but she was just happy I was finally making friends. The night started normal enough. We played video games in his basement, ate way too much pizza, and watched some terrible horror movie that we spent more time laughing at than actually watching. Brian's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Fitzgerald, seemed nice but distant. His dad was this tall, thin guy with thick glasses who barely spoke, except to remind us to keep the noise down. and his mom had this nervous energy about her, constantly offering us snacks and drinks, but never really making eye contact. Around midnight, we crashed in Brian's room on the second floor. He had this huge bedroom with dark wood paneling and these heavy curtains that blocked out all the streetlight. I set up my sleeping bag on the floor next to his bed, and we talked for maybe another hour about school, girls we liked, typical teenage stuff, before finally passing out. I woke up around 3 in the morning with that urgent need to pee that comes from drinking too many sodas before bed. The house was completely silent, except for Brian's snoring and the occasional creak of old wood settling. I fumbled around in the dark for my phone to use as a flashlight, trying not to wake Brian, and slowly made my way to the bedroom door. The hallway was pitch black, and the bathroom was at the far end, past several closed doors. As I shuffled along the worn carpet, my bare feet making almost no sound, I heard something that made me stop dead. It was a rhythmic thumping, muffled but deliberate, coming from behind one of the doors to my left. Not random like pipes or a washing machine. This had a pattern to it. 3 quick thumps, pause, 3 more thumps, pause. Like someone knocking, but duller, as if their fist was wrapped in cloth or they were hitting something soft. The door it was coming from had one of those old-fashioned keyholes, the kind you could actually look through, and there was a sliver of light seeping out from underneath. I stood there in that dark hallway needing to pee so badly but completely frozen by this sound. The pattern kept going. Thump, 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 pause. And then I heard something else that made every hair on my arm stand up. It was a voice, very faint, like someone trying to yell through a gag or thick walls. I couldn't make out words, just these desperate muffled sounds between the thumping. My first thought was maybe Brian's parents were into some weird stuff I didn't want to know about, but something about the desperation in that muffled voice felt wrong, really wrong. I must have stood there for 2 or 3 minutes just listening, trying to convince myself it was nothing while my bladder screamed at me to move. Finally, I forced myself to keep walking to the bathroom, each step feeling like it took forever. The thumping continued behind me as I quietly closed the bathroom door and flicked on the light. My face in the mirror looked pale and scared, and I splashed some cold water on it after finishing my business. When I opened the bathroom door again, the hallway was silent, completely silent. No thumping, no muffled voice, nothing. Somehow that was worse. I practically ran back to Brian's room, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might wake him up. I slipped back into my sleeping bag and lay there staring at the ceiling, listening. About 10 minutes later, I heard footsteps in the hallway, slow, deliberate ones. They stopped right outside Brian's door for what felt like an eternity before continuing on. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When morning came and Brian woke up around 8, I tried to act casual, but I had to know. While we were eating cereal in his kitchen, his parents nowhere to be seen, I asked him about the door in the hallway, the one with the light under it. His whole demeanor changed instantly. He stopped mid-chew, put his spoon down, and gave me this look I'll never forget, part warning, part fear. "That's just the boiler room," he said, his voice flat and rehearsed. "Old house, makes weird noises. My parents told me never to go in there. Something about asbestos or whatever." He quickly changed the subject to some new game coming out, but his leg was bouncing under the table the entire time. When his mom came into the kitchen a few minutes later, she had dark circles under her eyes and kept glancing at the ceiling, like she was listening for something. She asked if we slept well, and before I could answer, Brian jumped in with an enthusiastic, "Yeah, totally knocked out all night." I made up some excuse about my mom needing me home early and called her around 9:30. While waiting for her to pick me up, I sat on their front porch with my backpack, and that's when I noticed something that made my chest tighten. Their garage window had a view into part of the basement, and I could see stacks of what looked like bulk food supplies, cases of water bottles, towers of canned goods, huge bags of rice. But what caught my eye was a small pink backpack hanging on a hook, covered in unicorn patches and clearly meant for a little kid. Brian had told me he was an only child. When my mom pulled up, Mrs. Fitzgerald came out to wave goodbye, and her smile was so forced it looked painful. As we drove away, I turned to look back at the house and saw Mr. Fitzgerald standing in an upstairs window. Not the master bedroom, but the room where I'd heard the noises. He wasn't looking at our car. He was looking down at something in his hands, and even from that distance I could see his shoulders shaking. My mom asked me about the sleepover on the drive home, and I gave her generic answers, but my mind was racing. I spent the entire weekend thinking about that sound, that muffled voice, the pink backpack. I wanted to tell someone, but what would I even say? That I heard weird noises in an old house? That my friend's parents seemed tired? Monday came and Brian wasn't at school. Tuesday, Wednesday, still no Brian. By Thursday, I was genuinely worried and asked our chemistry teacher if she knew anything. She just said the family had some personal matters to deal with. That afternoon, I took the bus to Brian's neighborhood instead of going straight home, not really sure what I was planning to do. Maybe I just wanted to make sure everything was okay, or maybe some part of me needed to know what was behind that door. I never made it to their house. 2 blocks away, the street was completely blocked off with police cars, their lights flashing but sirens off. There must have been 8 or 9 vehicles, including 2 ambulances and what looked like an FBI van. I got off the bus and stood with a small crowd of neighbors who had gathered on the corner, everyone whispering and pointing. An older woman next to me, wearing a bathrobe despite it being 4 in the afternoon, was telling anyone who would listen that she'd been calling the police for weeks about strange things at the Fitzgerald house. She said she'd seen them carrying in supplies at weird hours, heard crying that didn't match anyone in the family, and noticed their trash cans were always full of empty medicine bottles and bloody rags. I knew something wasn't right, she kept saying, clutching her phone like a lifeline. A mother knows these things. I have grandchildren. I know what fear sounds like. Then I saw her. The paramedics were wheeling out a stretcher, and even though the person was covered in blankets, I could see tangled dark hair and one pale, thin arm with ligature marks around the wrist. Behind the stretcher came a female officer carrying that same pink unicorn backpack I'd seen in the garage. The woman on the stretcher was conscious, gripping the paramedic's hand so tight her knuckles were white, and when they passed close to where we were standing, I heard her speak. Her voice was hoarse and broken, but she kept repeating, "Thank you, thank you, thank you," over and over. Right behind the ambulance, officers were leading out Mr. and Mrs. Fitzgerald in handcuffs. Brian's mom was sobbing hysterically, screaming about how they had no choice and she would have died anyway. His dad just stared straight ahead, his face completely blank. And then came Brian, not in handcuffs but flanked by 2 officers, his head down, refusing to look at anyone. The story came out over the next few days through local news and school gossip. The woman was named Stephanie Colbert, 23 years old, and she'd been held in that room for 4 months. The Fitzgeralds had apparently hit her with their car late one night on a rural road and instead of calling for help, decided to keep her. The news said something about Mr. Fitzgerald being a former medical student who'd been kicked out of his program years ago, and he'd been treating her injuries in that locked room. The pink backpack belonged to Stephanie's daughter, who she'd been driving to see when the accident happened. The little girl was safe with her father, but Stephanie had been listed as a missing person all those months. The thumping I'd heard was her only way to communicate. She'd loosened a pipe just enough to bang it against the floor when she heard movement in the house. She'd been trying to signal for help every night, hoping someone, anyone, would hear her. The neighbor who'd been calling the police finally convinced them to investigate when she recorded the sounds through her adjoining wall. I never spoke to Brian again. His family's house was empty within a week, a for sale sign posted in the overgrown yard. I heard he went to live with relatives in another state while his parents awaited trial. Sometimes I wonder if he knew all along, or if he'd convinced himself to believe the lies. I still think about that night, about standing in that dark hallway, paralyzed by indecision. Part of me wishes I'd been brave enough to do something right then. Maybe try to pick the lock or call 911, or even just wake Brian and demand real answers. But I was just a scared kid who wanted to believe it was nothing. The therapist my parents made me see afterward said it wasn't my fault, that I couldn't have known. but I still hear those muffled sounds sometimes when I'm trying to fall asleep. At least I can comfort myself knowing that Stephanie survived, that she made it back to her daughter. She was the brave one, never giving up, banging on that pipe every single night, believing someone would eventually hear her call for help. And finally, someone did. Most people have that one sleepover story from high school that sticks with them forever. Mine happened during my junior year, spring of 2015, when I was 17, and still naive enough to think the worst thing that could happen at a friend's house was getting caught sneaking out. I was at Courtney Gallagher's place for her birthday weekend. She'd invited 6 of us girls from the volleyball team to stay over Friday night. The Gallaghers lived in this massive colonial house on Sycamore Avenue, the kind with the wraparound porch and perfectly manicured hedges that made you think nothing bad could ever happen there. Her dad owned a chain of hardware stores, and her mom was this tiny woman named Dottie, who always smelled like vanilla extract and kept offering us homemade cookies every 20 minutes. Everything about that house screamed normal suburban family, except for one thing that I noticed right away, but didn't think much about at first. The basement door had 3 different locks on it. A regular doorknob lock, a deadbolt, and this heavy-duty sliding bolt at the top that looked like something you'd see on a barn door. When we first got there around 7 that Friday evening, Courtney's dad, Mr. Gallagher, was standing right next to it like some kind of guard while we carried our sleeping bags through the kitchen. He was this tall, wiry guy with premature gray hair and these thick carpenter's hands that kept fidgeting with his wedding ring. Every time one of us walked past that door with our overnight bags, he'd shift his weight and clear his throat, watching us like we might suddenly decide to yank it open. Mrs. Gallagher kept steering us toward the living room, her voice pitched just a little too high, saying things like, "Oh, you girls will love the setup we have upstairs in Courtney's room." But it was the way they both kept glancing at each other, these quick, tense looks that made me pay attention. Like they were having a whole conversation without words, checking to make sure we were all staying away from that door. Around 9 that night, after we'd demolished 2 pizzas and were sprawled across Courtney's bedroom floor painting our nails, her little brother Kevin burst through the door asking if he could grab his Nintendo from the basement. The kid was maybe 12, all braces and gangly limbs, and the second those words left his mouth, the whole room went dead quiet. Courtney's face drained of color, and she actually knocked over the bottle of purple nail polish she was holding, sending it spreading across the hardwood like a little toxic spill. "You know you're not allowed down there," she hissed at him, scrambling to clean up the mess with these jerky, panicked movements. Kevin rolled his eyes and muttered something about it being stupid, but then we heard heavy footsteps on the stairs. Mr. Gallagher appeared in the doorway, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles twitching. He didn't yell or anything, just crooked his finger at Kevin and said in this low, controlled voice, "Come with me, son. Now." The way Kevin's shoulders slumped, and how he followed his dad out without another word made my chest feel tight. We could hear muffled voices from down the hall, Mr. Gallagher's deep rumble mixing with what sounded like Kevin crying. The rest of the night, everyone pretended like that whole scene hadn't happened, but there was this weird energy in the air, like the house itself was holding its breath. We watched movies, braided each other's hair, did all the normal sleepover stuff, but Courtney kept checking her phone and jumping at every little noise from downstairs. Around midnight, when we were getting ready to actually sleep, my friend Jenna asked if we could grab some water from the kitchen, and Courtney practically tripped over herself to say she'd get it for us, that we should just stay upstairs, make ourselves comfortable. But here's the thing. I've always been too curious for my own good, and the way everyone in that house acted like the basement was full of nuclear waste or something made me need to know what was down there. I waited until about 3 in the morning, when everyone was passed out and snoring softly in their sleeping bags, their faces slack and peaceful in the blue glow from Courtney's phone charger. I could hear Mr. Gallagher's thunderous snoring from the master bedroom down the hall, this rhythmic rumble that meant he was deep asleep. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure it would wake someone up, but I slipped out of my sleeping bag anyway, my bare feet silent on the carpet. The house felt different in the dark. All those cheerful family photos on the walls turned into shadowy rectangles, and the grandfather clock in the hallway ticked so loud it sounded like someone counting down to something terrible. I made my way downstairs, avoiding the third step from the bottom that I'd heard creak earlier, my phone clutched in my sweaty palm with the flashlight ready but not on yet. The kitchen looked alien in the darkness. All the familiar daytime shapes transformed into potential threats, the island counter looming like a ship, the hanging pots gleaming dully like strange fruit. The basement door stood there, those 3 locks catching what little moonlight filtered through the window above the sink. My fingers trembled as I reached for the first lock, the doorknob one, which turned easily and silently, like it had been recently oiled. The deadbolt took more effort, making this tiny grinding sound that seemed to echo through the whole house. And I stood there frozen for what felt like hours, listening for any sign that someone had heard. The sliding bolt at the top was the worst. I had to stand on my tiptoes to reach it, and when it finally scraped open, the sound was like fingernails on metal, making every hair on my arms stand straight up. The door swung inward on silent hinges, revealing wooden stairs that disappeared into absolute blackness, and this smell hit me immediately. Not mold or dampness like you'd expect from a basement, but something chemical and sharp, like hospital disinfectant mixed with that copper penny smell you get when you bite your tongue too hard. I turned on my phone's flashlight, keeping it pointed down at the steps, which were covered in this industrial gray carpet that looked brand new. No wear patterns at all, despite this being an old house. Each step down felt like I was descending into something I shouldn't be seeing. Like those dreams where you know you're about to witness something that will change everything, but you can't stop moving forward. The walls were concrete, painted this institutional beige that reminded me of the counselor's office at school. And there were no cobwebs, no storage boxes, none of the usual basement clutter, just bare walls, and that chemical smell getting stronger. At the bottom of the stairs, the basement opened up into one large room, maybe 30 feet by 20 feet, and my flashlight beam caught something that made me actually gasp out loud, the sound echoing off the concrete walls. In the far corner, there was what looked like a makeshift living area, a stained twin mattress on the floor with rumpled sheets that had cartoon characters on them, the kind you'd buy for a little kid. Next to it sat a portable toilet, the blue plastic kind you see at construction sites, and a mini fridge that hummed quietly in the silence. But what made bile rise in my throat were the chains. Thick industrial chains bolted directly into the concrete floor with massive eye bolts, ending in leather cuffs that were worn smooth from use. There were scratch marks on the walls near the mattress, not random but deliberate, like someone had been keeping count of something. Hundreds and hundreds of little lines grouped in fives. A child's coloring book lay open on the floor, half-colored pictures of dinosaurs and spaceships, the crayons scattered around it like someone had left in the middle of coloring. The worst part was this Polaroid taped to the wall above the mattress. A boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, with sandy brown hair and a gap-toothed smile, wearing a Superman t-shirt. He looked happy in the photo, normal, like any kid you'd see at the park or the grocery store, and seeing that innocent face in this nightmare room made me want to scream. My legs felt like water, and I had to grip the stair railing to keep from collapsing as my brain tried to process what I was seeing. There were empty food containers stacked neatly by the mini fridge, juice boxes, crackers, those little cups of applesauce, all kids' food, all recent brands I recognized from commercials. Small TV sat on a milk crate, unplugged, with a stack of Disney DVDs next to it, their cheerful covers obscene in this context. I noticed a calendar on the wall with X's marked through the days, stopping abruptly 3 days ago, Thursday the 15th. And something about those stopped X's made my whole body go cold in a way that had nothing to do with the basement temperature. That's when I heard it. Footsteps above me. Not the slow shuffle of someone getting up for the bathroom, but quick, purposeful steps heading straight for the kitchen. The basement door was still open. I'd left it wide open like an idiot, and now someone was awake and walking directly toward it. I turned off my flashlight and stood there in the complete darkness, my breath coming in these short, ragged gasps that sounded deafening in the silence, trying to decide if I should hide or try to make it up the stairs. The footsteps stopped right at the top of the stairs, and I heard Mrs. Gallagher's voice, soft and trembling. "Harold, Harold, the door's open." Then Mr. O. Gallagher's heavier footsteps joined hers, and his voice came down, careful and measured. "Whoever's down there, we're not going to hurt you. Just come up slowly, okay? We can explain." The way he said explain made my skin prickle, because what could possibly explain what I'd just seen? But I didn't have a choice. There was nowhere to hide, no other exit, so I turned my flashlight back on and started climbing those stairs, each step feeling like I was walking toward my own execution. When I emerged into the kitchen, both Gallaghers were standing there in their pajamas, Mrs. Gallagher clutching her husband's arm so tight her knuckles were white, and Mr. Gallagher's face was this mask of exhaustion and something else. Relief? He actually looked relieved, and that scared me more than if he'd been angry. "Sit down," he said, gesturing to the kitchen table, and his voice was so tired, so defeated, that I found myself obeying without thinking. Mrs. Gallagher started making tea with shaking hands, like this was normal, like they had midnight conversations about their basement prison all the time. "His name is Tommy," Mrs. Gallagher said suddenly, her back still to me as she filled the kettle. "Tommy Brennan, but that's not what the news called him. They called him the Arlington Mall shooter's son." My brain struggled to connect the dots. I remembered that shooting from 2 years ago, some guy had killed 3 people at the mall food court before turning the gun on himself, and they'd said on the news that he'd had a son who disappeared right after. "Tommy saw everything," Mr. Gallagher said, his voice rough. "Watched his father do those terrible things, and then the state was going to put him in foster care, probably juvenile psychiatric. But my sister, she worked at child services. She called us crying, said this boy had been through enough, that the system would destroy what was left of him." Mrs. Gallagher turned around, tears streaming down her face, holding 3 mugs of tea like some bizarre peace offering. "We were just supposed to keep him for a few weeks, until they could find him proper placement out of state, somewhere nobody would know who his father was. But weeks turned into months, and he was so damaged, so violent sometimes. He tried to hurt Kevin twice, said his daddy taught him how to hurt people who made him angry." The Gallaghers sat there at their kitchen table, looking like broken people, and Mr. Gallagher pulled out his phone to show me texts from his sister, frantic messages about Tommy escaping from their basement 3 days ago. "We've been looking for him everywhere," he whispered. "Driving around at night, checking the woods behind the house, terrified he might hurt someone, or that someone might hurt him. He's only 9 years old, but he knows things no child should know." Mrs. Gallagher reached across the table like she wanted to grab my hand, but stopped herself. "We gave him everything we could down there, toys, food, movies, and we spent time with him every day when the kids were at school. We were teaching him, helping him, trying to undo what his father did to his mind. The chains were only for when he had his episodes, when he'd scream about wanting to do what Daddy did, wanting to make people stop laughing at him. The way she justified it, like they were heroes instead of people who'd kept a child chained in their basement, made me feel sick. But then Mr. Gallagher showed me more photos on his phone. Tommy's drawings from when he first arrived, horrible violent sketches of people with X's for eyes, and then newer ones of normal kid stuff, houses with sunshine and stick figure families. He was getting better, he insisted, scrolling through the pictures with desperate intensity. I sat there until dawn, listening to them talk, watching them cry, these seemingly normal people who'd done something monstrous while believing they were saving a child. They made me promise not to tell anyone, said Tommy's life depended on it, that if the authorities found him now, after what they'd done, both they and Tommy would be destroyed. I left that house at 7 in the morning, told my mom I felt sick and needed to come home, and spent the rest of the weekend trying to decide what to do. Then, that Monday, I saw it on the news, a body found in the woods near Riverside Park, a young boy who'd apparently been living rough and died of exposure. They showed his picture, and even though they didn't release his name, I recognized that gap-toothed smile immediately. The report said he was a runaway from out of state. No family looking for him, case closed. The Gallaghers kept their secret. Kevin went back to being a normal kid and Courtney finished high school like nothing had happened. I never told anyone until now, 10 years later, because who would believe me? And maybe part of me still wonders if those chains in the basement were really the worst thing that could have happened to Tommy, or if the Gallaghers were right, and the system would have been crueler than their makeshift prison with its Disney movies and dinosaur coloring books. It was the spring of 2018, and I was 14, spending most weekends bouncing between friends' houses because my parents worked double shifts at the hospital. That particular Friday, I was staying at Samantha's place, this gorgeous colonial house on Birchwood Lane with perfectly trimmed hedges and one of those kitchens straight out of a magazine. Sam and I had been best friends since 6th grade, and her mom, Mrs. Dalton, always made me feel like part of the family. She'd bake these incredible cinnamon rolls from scratch every Saturday morning and knew exactly how I liked my eggs. The Daltons seemed to have everything together. Family portraits on every wall, a golden retriever named Biscuit, who'd greet you with muddy paws, and this warm atmosphere that made you never want to leave. We'd planned the whole weekend out. Horror movie marathon, experimenting with some ridiculous face masks Sam bought online, and attempting to make crepes because we'd watched too many cooking shows. The night started like any other sleepover. We gorged ourselves on pizza, painted each other's nails in colors with ridiculous names like Midnight Conspiracy, and stayed up way too late talking about which boys in our class had gotten cute over spring break. Around 2 a.m., after Sam had finally crashed mid-sentence about some drama with her lab partner, I needed water because all that salty popcorn had caught up with me. Their house had this quirk where the upstairs bathroom sink tasted metallic, so I always went down to the kitchen for drinking water. As I padded down their carpeted stairs in my fuzzy socks, trying to avoid the creaky third step from the bottom, I noticed a light coming from the master bedroom at the end of the hall. Through the partially open door, I could see Mrs. Dalton pulling clothes from her dresser and shoving them into this beat-up brown leather suitcase I'd never seen before. Not the matching luggage set they usually used for family trips. She was still wearing her work clothes from earlier, this navy blue blazer with a coffee stain on the sleeve that I'd noticed at dinner. But her usually perfect hair was a mess, strands sticking to her forehead with sweat. What really got me was how she kept checking her phone every few seconds, then glancing at the bedroom door like she expected someone to burst in. Her movements were jerky, almost violent, as she yanked open drawers and dumped their contents onto the bed, sorting through papers and small boxes with this desperate urgency. I must have shifted my weight because the floorboard creaked, and she whipped around so fast that several papers fluttered to the floor. When our eyes met, her face went through this rapid transformation, shock, fear, then this forced calm that didn't reach her eyes. "Sweetie, what are you doing up?" she whispered. But her voice had this sharp edge I'd never heard before, like when you accidentally touch a hot stove and try to act like it doesn't hurt. I mumbled something about getting water, and she nodded too quickly, too many times, already turning back to her suitcase while saying I should use the bathroom upstairs, that the kitchen was being cleaned. But I could see into the kitchen from where I stood. It was dark and spotless like always. Mrs. Dalton kept talking, rambling really, about how she had an emergency business trip. Her sister in Kansas was sick. No, wait. It was a conference she'd forgotten about, and the words tumbled out in this stream that made no sense. She grabbed a jewelry box from her nightstand, dumped the whole thing into a plastic grocery bag, without even looking at what she was taking. Her hands moved constantly, packing, unpacking, repacking the same items like she couldn't decide what was important enough to take. Through it all, she kept stealing glances at me, and I realized she was waiting for me to leave, needed me to leave, but my feet felt glued to that spot in the hallway. Finally, she stopped packing and walked over to me, placed both hands on my shoulders with this grip that was just a little too tight. Her perfume, usually this pleasant vanilla scent, mixed with nervous sweat, created this sour smell that made me want to step back. "Listen to me," she said, and her eyes had this intensity that reminded me of those nature documentaries where the gazelle realizes the lion is watching. "You were sleepwalking, honey. You had a bad dream and came downstairs, but you're going back to bed now, and in the morning. This was all just a confused nightmare, okay?" The way she said it wasn't really a question, and her fingers pressed harder into my shoulders with each word. She walked me back to the stairs, her hand on my back, pushing just firmly enough that I had no choice but to move forward. At the bottom of the stairs, she pulled me into this sudden fierce hug that felt nothing like her usual warm embraces. This was desperate, almost apologetic, and she held on for so long I could feel her heart racing against my chest. The rest of the night, I lay on Sam's bedroom floor in my sleeping bag, staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars on her ceiling and listening to every sound in the house. Around 4 a.m., I heard the garage door open. They had one of those old ones that groaned like it was in pain, followed by a car engine starting. Not the familiar purr of Mrs. Dalton's Lexus, but something rougher, older. Through Sam's window, I caught a glimpse of taillights disappearing down the street, but it was some boxy sedan I didn't recognize. The house felt different after that, like when you know someone's been in your room touching your stuff even though nothing's obviously moved. When Sam's alarm went off at 9, she stretched and asked if I wanted pancakes or waffles for breakfast. Completely normal, like her mom hadn't fled in the middle of the night. We went downstairs, and Mr. Dalton was already in the kitchen, still in his pajamas, making coffee with mechanical movements. His face blank in a way that made me think he'd been standing there for hours. Sam bounced around the kitchen, chattering about how her mom had to leave early for a medical conference in Houston. Funny, because just hours earlier Mrs. Dalton had told me it was Kansas, then changed it to something else entirely. Mr. Dalton barely responded to his daughter, just kept stirring his coffee even though he took it black, the spoon clinking against the mug in this rhythmic pattern that set my teeth on edge. When Sam asked where the cinnamon roll dough was, her dad said her mom forgot to make it, but I'd seen Mrs. Dalton put a bowl in the fridge the night before, covered in plastic wrap with a sticky note that said, "Saturday breakfast," in her loopy handwriting. The whole morning felt like acting in a play where everyone knew their lines except me. Sam never questioned why her mom's car was still in the garage, or why her dad was wearing the same rumpled clothes from yesterday, or why Biscuit kept whining at the master bedroom door that was now locked. Even when I tried to bring it up casually, "Hey, your mom seemed stressed last night," Sam just shrugged and changed the subject to some gossip about our English teacher. I made excuses to leave early, claimed my mom needed help with something, and Sam didn't even protest like she normally would have. Mr. Dalton offered to drive me home in this flat voice, and during the 10-minute ride, he gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles went white, never once looking at me in the rearview mirror. The next few days at school, Sam acted completely normal, laughing at lunch, complaining about algebra homework, planning our next sleepover, but she had these dark circles under her eyes that her concealer couldn't quite hide. She kept saying her mom was extending her trip, important meetings, you know how it is, but her voice would go up at the end like she was asking a question instead of stating a fact. Other kids started noticing too. Sam's mom always picked her up from school, always volunteered for bake sales, and suddenly she was just gone. Teachers would ask Sam if everything was okay at home, and she'd flash this bright smile that never quite made it to her eyes, insisting everything was perfect. Her mom would be back any day now. Exactly 1 week later, I was eating breakfast when my dad looked up from his tablet with this expression I'll never forget. Confusion mixed with recognition, like when you finally solve a puzzle you've been staring at for hours. "Hey, isn't this your friend's mom?" he asked, turning the screen toward me, and there was Mrs. Dalton's face staring back at me from a news article. The headline made my orange juice turn sour in my mouth. "Local financial advisor wanted for embezzling $2. $3 million from client accounts." The article said she'd been siphoning money for over 3 years, creating fake investment reports, moving funds between accounts to cover her tracks when clients asked questions. They'd discovered it when an elderly client tried to withdraw money for cancer treatment and found his entire life savings gone. The photo they used was from some company website, Mrs. Dalton in that same navy blazer, smiling with perfect teeth, looking like the trustworthy professional she pretended to be. According to the article, she was last seen at a gas station 40 miles outside of town, around 4:30 a.m. on Saturday morning, paying cash, her car captured on security footage heading toward the interstate. My mom immediately called Sam's house, but the number was disconnected. I texted Sam, asking if she was okay, if she needed anything, but she left me on read. At school on Monday, Sam's desk was empty, and stayed empty for the rest of the week. Rumors flew around like wildfire. Some kids said the family went into witness protection. Others claimed Mr. Dalton was in on it too. And one girl swore she saw Sam at a grocery store 2 towns over with her hair dyed black. The truth came out gradually, in pieces. Mr. Dalton had genuinely known nothing, had gone to bed that Friday night thinking his wife was beside him, only to wake up to an empty bed and a note saying she was sorry. The house on Birchwood Lane went up for sale within a month, a for sale by owner sign appearing overnight like a shameful secret. I drove by once with my mom and already it looked different, the hedges growing wild, newspapers piling up despite no one living there, Biscuit's doghouse still in the backyard like a monument to the family that used to exist. About 2 months later, I got a message from Sam on Instagram from a new account with no profile picture, just a black square. It was short. I know you saw her that night. Thank you for not telling anyone. We're okay. Before I could reply, the account was deleted, like she'd been waiting just long enough to send that single message. I never told anyone about what I witnessed. Not the police who came to school asking questions. Not the reporters who somehow got my phone number. Not even my parents who kept pressing me for details about that last sleepover. Part of me felt guilty, like maybe I should have said something. But what would it have changed? Mrs. Dalton was already gone. The money was already stolen. And those families she'd robbed were already destroyed. All my testimony would have done was confirm the exact time she left. And somehow that felt like a betrayal of those cinnamon roll mornings and the woman who used to braid my hair while we watched movies. I found out later that they caught Mrs. Dalton 3 months after she ran, living under a fake name in some small town in New Mexico, working as a waitress in a diner that served terrible coffee. She got 15 years in federal prison, and supposedly Mr. Dalton divorced her before the trial even started. Sam and her dad moved somewhere up north, Minnesota or Wisconsin, depending on who you asked, and started over with new last names, trying to escape the shadow of what she'd done. Sometimes I still dream about that night, about Mrs. Dalton's wild eyes and trembling hands, about the way she hugged me like she was saying goodbye to more than just me. The strangest part is that I still can't reconcile the two versions of her in my head. The woman who taught me how to French braid and made the best hot chocolate I've ever tasted, and the criminal who destroyed dozens of lives and abandoned her own family in the middle of the night. I guess that's the thing that really haunts me. How someone can be both of those people at once, and how you never really know which version is the real one until it's too late. I grew up in a small 2-story house with my parents, my younger sister, and our overly friendly golden retriever, Max. This happened back when I was around 13, during one of those endless summer breaks where every night felt like an excuse to stay up late. My best friend at the time, Tyler, had convinced his parents to let a few of us crash at his place for a sleepover. His house was older, the kind with creaky floorboards and a faint smell of cedar in the walls, but it had a big living room with a huge couch, so we didn't care. There were 5 of us sprawled out in sleeping bags, surrounded by soda cans and empty chip bags, trying to outlast each other in a marathon of bad horror movies. It was past midnight when we first heard it, a slow, deliberate thump from above. We all paused mid-conversation, looking up at the ceiling. Tyler rolled his eyes immediately and muttered, "Relax, it's just the house settling." The rest of us traded uneasy glances. The sound wasn't random like pipes or the wind. It had a rhythm to it, like someone walking. Max's head popped up from his blanket in the corner, ears perked toward the ceiling. That, more than anything, made my chest tighten a little. Dogs don't react to creaky wood for no reason. A few minutes later, the noises came again. This time it wasn't just footsteps. It was a dragging sound, slow and gritty, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. The sound would stop for a moment, then start again in a different spot, like it was moving from one end of the upstairs to the other. Tyler tried to laugh it off, but no one joined in. I remember staring at the ceiling, picturing the layout of the house. Above us was the hallway to the bedrooms, but it didn't make sense. His parents were out of town, and his older brother was staying with friends that weekend. The second floor should have been empty. We tried to distract ourselves with another movie, but the tension made every little sound seem amplified. Then came the creak of a door hinge, so slow it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't loud, but it carried through the stillness like a whisper. Tyler froze this time, staring at the ceiling like he was doing the math in his head. The dragging started again, faint but steady. Max let out a low, quiet growl, a sound I'd never heard from him before. No one said it out loud, but I think we were all starting to realize that this wasn't just an old house making noises. Tyler grabbed the remote and muted the TV, and the room went dead silent except for the faint shuffle above us. It was quieter now, almost like whoever or whatever was up there was trying not to be heard. We sat frozen in our sleeping bags, eyes darting toward the staircase in the hallway. Nobody wanted to be the first to say we should check. Finally, Tyler muttered that we should all just stay downstairs and ignore it. He said it with confidence, but his voice was tight, like he didn't even believe himself. Max padded toward the stairs and stopped at the bottom, staring upward with his tail stiff and ears angled forward. We tried to sleep after that, but every creak in the ceiling made my pulse kick up again. At some point, I must have drifted off, because I woke up just before sunrise to that dragging noise again. This time, it was followed by a soft tapping, irregular and deliberate, almost like knuckles knocking on wood from inside the walls. I propped myself up, scanning the room. Everyone else was asleep except Tyler, who was lying there with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling. He whispered that it had been going on for the past hour. The air felt heavier somehow, like the whole house was holding its breath. When daylight finally poured through the blinds, the fear dulled a little. We convinced ourselves it must have been pipes, or the wind, or something stupid our tired brains exaggerated. By mid-morning, we were laughing about it, turning it into a running joke while we packed up our sleeping bags. But when Tyler went to get something from the kitchen, he came back pale, holding a dusty old key in his hand. He said it had been sitting right in the middle of the hallway upstairs. None of us had been up there. We didn't think much of it until the next day when Tyler called me, his voice shaking. His parents had come home that morning and found the attic door, one none of us even knew existed, slightly open. The police had been called, and after a couple hours of searching, they found signs someone had been living up there: a sleeping bag, food wrappers, and a small pile of clothes. The officer told them it looked like the person had been there for weeks, moving around the house when no one was home. I remember sitting on my bed after that call, thinking about the dragging sounds, the creaking door, and how close that attic must have been to where we slept that night. Tyler said the cops thought the person had probably been sneaking down at night for food, which made my stomach knot when I remembered the kitchen was just a few steps from where we were sleeping. The idea of someone quietly moving around us while we were joking and half asleep felt so wrong. The police couldn't say how the person got in, but they guessed a window in the garage had been left unlocked at some point. What unsettled me most was how easily they could have kept living there if we hadn't heard those noises. That night, I barely slept, replaying the sounds in my head. The dragging noise made sense now. It was probably their sleeping bag or a box being moved around, but the slow door creak still bothered me. It didn't sound like someone opening it quickly to grab something and go. It sounded like they were just standing there, letting it open inch by inch. Watching. Listening. The more I thought about it, the more I wondered if they'd been aware of us that entire time. Maybe even standing over one of the upstairs vents, hearing every word we said. A couple weeks later, Tyler told me the police never caught the person. Whoever it was had disappeared without leaving much behind. His parents had the attic sealed, the locks changed, and security cameras installed. But he said the house didn't feel the same anymore. Even during the day, he'd catch himself listening for footsteps, half expecting them to start again. We stopped doing sleepovers at his place after that. Not because his parents said no, but because none of us could shake the image of someone quietly pacing just above our heads. It's been years since that night, but sometimes when I'm lying in bed and hear the faintest noise from the ceiling, I think about Tyler's attic. I think about the knocking, the dragging, and that door creak in the dark. And I always wonder, how many other people are sleeping just a few feet away from someone they don't even know is there?